maybe 10 years or 11 years before Gina graduated from high school. It was the summer of 1967. I was about 13 years old, and my grandfather, Walter Shear, born in 1893, he was about my age now. The farmhouse where he and my grandfather lived and where I spent every summer of my life was supplied by water through a wooden pipe from a spring house that sat atop a nearby hill. After several decades, it had submerged beneath the soil, and finally it collapsed, leaving the house without water. While my grandfather searched for the busted pipe, I was tasked with fetching water from the old schoolhouse pump that was down a short, steep hill and across a country road about 200 yards away. My handy grandfather fashioned me a yoke, so that I could carry 2 full buckets of water multiple times, multiple trips to fill every pot as well as the old clawfoot tub. My grandfather finally gave up on trying to find this broken pipe and decided to drill a well. But where do you tell the well drillers where to drill the well? So he cut a slender green branch and trimmed it into a handy Y shape with slim handles. And he twisted it a little so that the tip went up. And he walked slowly across the mowed pasture that was our lawn in front of the house until the stick tip bent downwards. And he announced, "Right here is where the well drillers will dig the well." Using a divining rod to locate water was news to me. I tried it. I held that Y branch and it pulled down just where my grandfather's had pulled down, and I was determined not to let it pull down. So Walter, my grandfather, told the drillers where to drill, and they found water exactly where he said it would be, 30 feet down, not that far. And there they found an underground river that I later found was actually 20 feet deep, running beneath the property. We still use that well to this day. Divining rods were a mystery to me then, and they remain a mystery to me today. But what I didn't think then or now was that some divinity was showing me through the divining rod where water was to be found. Every religion on earth once had or still has some kind of divinatory practice that seeks to find answers to important questions like innocence or guilt, truth or falsehood, or advice in decision making. I have been to many religious ceremonies over the years, something I'm deeply interested in, and have been part of divinatory practices in these various religions where they ask the gods whether the worship service was acceptable. These practices come in different forms, but the common belief is that this world is saturated with the divine. The sacred infuses the world. The sacred is here all the time, everywhere. Some ancient divinatory practices include reading the entrails of sacrificed animals. I've never been to that kind of service. Interpreting the flights of birds. The ancient Chinese read patterns of cracks in cleaned out tortoise shells when it was heated. Of course, only a specially trained person with the proper tools, adhering to the rigorous requirements of the practice, can and is allowed to divine the will of God. Of the many different divinatory practices in the ancient Near East was casting lots. The ancient Hebrews had a practice of casting the holy dice, the Urim and the Thummim. Urim means cursed. Thummim means faultless. And these names refer to the deity's judgment of an accused person. In other words, Urim and Thummim were used to answer questions of innocence or guilt, even yes and no. In the books of Samuel, whenever Saul or David wished to question God, they asked a priest, the only authorized person to cast the Urim and Thummim. The Bible has references to divinatory practices other than casting the holy dice. For example, dream interpretation. But I want to speak with you a little bit this morning about those Genesis verses and their meaning for the characters in the story. In our Genesis story, they are called household gods. In Hebrew, teraphim. Laban calls them gods, but they are not the major gods of the ancient Near East like Marduk or Baal or Inanna, but rather personal household gods. Teraphim varied in size. In 1 Samuel chapter 19, I love this story. Micah is one of Saul's youngest daughters who he's given to David as a wife. And she, of course, is besotted with the handsome, strong, successful warrior boy, David. And she finds out that her dad has gone a little off and wants to kill David. And she wakes him one night in his bed and says, David, you got to get out of here. My father has come to kill you. So she gets a rope. She's already got the rope ready. She lowers it down through the upper story window and encourages David to down the rope and out of there. And so he does. And she, of course, is all ready. She takes one of the household gods, the teraphim, and she picks it up, larger size. David was an important guy. Carries it over to his bed, puts a little bit of goat skin on top so it looks like his hair, and throws a blanket over the whole thing. And the assassins come in and they stab the bed, and all they do is hit this teraphim statue. And then they ask, oh, why did you do this? What happened? And she said, oh, David made me do it. Wandering Arameans, like Laban, were nomadic shepherds who could carry their portable statues. Archaeological excavations have uncovered some clay or stone seraphim which are small, portable, 6-9 inches tall. Genesis chapter 31 tells how when Laban was out in the field shearing his flocks of sheep, Rachel, one of the younger daughters, sneaks into her father's tent and steals his teraphim. She takes off with them. And when everybody leaves, she has her father's statues. The statues were thought to have divinatory powers. They could tell you things that you did not know. Rachel stole them so that her father would not be able to trace their whereabouts as they secretly fled him. Other interpreters claim that Rachel believed that teraphim possessed a kind of divine power to bless barren women with children, an important issue for both Leah, older sister, and Rachel. But not only did the teraphim have divinatory and magical properties, they were symbols of authority of the owner. Laban's judicial authority and political power, represented by his teraphim, was founded upon his wealth, the size of his herds, the number of persons in his extended family, the number of others under obligation, employment, or protection. Laban was a godfather. Some commentators think Rachel took Laban's teraphim for economic rather than political or divinatory reasons. So they have all sorts of different kinds of meanings. And that the ownership, whoever owned the teraphim, meant that they had inheritance claims. So some people think, oh, Rachel grabbed them so that she could then say, Jacob has some of these inheritance claims. Possessing the statues was like having a final will and testament, will and testament, stating that whoever possesses them inherited everything. It could be that Rachel believed that possessing Laban's teraphim gave her some protection from his wrath. She was already aware that he was going to be furious that they snuck away. And so why not add a little bit of insult to injury and grab the teraphim and hit the road? Maybe she thought that she could obtain some sort of pardon because Laban would eventually catch up with them, because it was really difficult to move a large herd of people and cattle and goats and sheep and camels. You can't move those things fast. And so she knew that Laban would eventually catch up. But she doesn't give them up when Laban catches them. In fact, she discourages them looking through her person or baggage with the threat of uncleanliness by mentioning that she was menstruating, and that ensured that all the men would keep their distance so as to maintain their ritual purity. Rachel's theft of the teraphim could have been an attempt to establish tribal leadership for Jacob. Rightfully, the teraphim denoted her older brother's inheritance rights, but she stole them for Jacob. They were for Laban like a badge of office, a real estate deed, a last will and testament, an inventory of everything that you owned, and so much more. Knowing this, we can better understand Laban's extreme displeasure with their loss. I don't think Rachel was afraid of the consequences of her being caught with the statue she stole. Despite Laban declaring that what he really wanted to do in these verses and why he was angry, he said, I wanted to say goodbye to my grandchildren, and you took them away. But then he says at the end of all of his speeches, and why did you steal my household gods? We know that that was really what was important to Laban, a godfather. Laban's search was all about this Bible verse. If Laban found them, he would have reclaimed them and left Rachel and Jacob. But he did not find them. But knowing that they had been stolen by someone in the caravan made for bad blood between Jacob and Laban. The estimated time period in history when Laban and Jacob, Leah and Rachel lived was about the year 1880 BCE, nearly 4,000 years ago. Laban and his clan were denoted in Genesis as wandering Arameans. Jacob was included in this identification, but was renamed Israel when they settled in the land of Canaan. His descendants were called Israelites when they were released from slavery in Egypt centuries later. This was their identifying name. These people remained Israelites for centuries until the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE. And when they trickle back to Judea after 2 generations in captivity, they are much changed. History will identify this newly reformed monotheistic religion that emerged from Babylon as Judaism. People from the land of Judea, Jews. The book of Genesis was probably compiled, collated, and edited from many ancient sources during this Babylonian exile, which began around 598 BCE, and with the deportation of the Israelites to Babylon, followed by the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BCE. The exile ended in 538 BCE, when Cyrus the Great of Persia allowed all the Babylonian captives, not just the Israelites, but all of them to return to their respective homelands, really robbed the Babylonians of a vast slave population that served their needs in the capital cities in the ancient Near East under Babylonian power. One can discern the importance of the theme of the move to exclusive monotheism in this part of the book of Genesis. When the exiled Jews lived amidst the ubiquitous polytheism of the Babylonian Empire, meaning that there were gods, many of them, everywhere, all the time. The Judean exiles in Babylon were determined not to let their history fade while living in captivity under the polytheistic influence of the capital city of the world. And so they reframed the story of their faith as a struggle against the attractions of polytheism. In Genesis 35, verses 2 through 4, God says to Jacob, quote, "Get rid of the foreign gods that you have with you." The admonition of God to Jacob is really also addressed to the captives in Babylon. And this was then a theme throughout much of the Old Testament. As I mentioned, the stories included in Genesis were probably compiled during this Babylonian exile. They were ancient stories that they had and used and knew by heart, and an editor collected them so that he could give them to the people, the captives in Babylon, so that they would know their heritage. And also then putting in every once in a while a little bit of a line that says, "Leave those household gods behind. There is only one God." When Cyrus allowed all the captive populations to return to their homelands, it is estimated now 40,000 Jews eventually trickled back to Judea over the next several decades, from 7,000 who arrive to 40,000 who return to Judea. The captives accepted the fact that during the time of Laban and Jacob, Rachel and Leah, the practice of polytheism was common, but they were determined to preserve their distinctive identity, now growing more and more important as monotheists, as it is clearly emphasized in the book of Genesis. But possessing teraphim was a practice that faded very slowly. One would think that with all of this dramatic activity going on, that they would immediately, always, everywhere, throw away their teraphim. Not the case. Josephus, the Jewish general and historian, relates how, even in his own time, in the decades following the life of St. Paul of Tarsus, just after that time, he says that it was customary for Jews to take their teraphim with them when they were emigrating. So even then, during the time of Jesus, Jews having teraphim was still a common practice. The exiles in Babylon were determined to distinguish themselves as a covenant people dedicated to one God and resist the influence of state-sponsored polytheism that they were immersed in. Throughout the Old Testament can be found stories of resisting this lure of polytheism. Golden calf, anyone? The poet-theologian who composed the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 lived over 1,000 years after the time of Laban the Aramean, when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was only one God among many, kind of like a CEO of a divine pantheon, first among many. Jewish rulers and priests made sure the other deities faded away so that only Yahweh, the one God, would remain as the only God. But becoming monotheists, it came at a price. The intimacy of the divine for the wandering Arameans, where the gods lived in the natural world, who could be consulted by divination, who had a special sacred places, like Bethel, with its column anointed by oil, where promises are made. And these teraphim had magical powers. All of this immediate intimacy and magic and power and authority of these teraphim all gets replaced by an omnipotent creator God who is supernatural, the God that we recognize now as the God of both Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Rachel stole the teraphim, and Jacob possessed them but a little while. Because, as we know in Genesis, soon after Jacob returned to Judea, God says to him, "Get rid of the foreign gods that you have with you. Get rid of them." The time had come to dump the teraphim. God's admonition to Jacob in chapter 35 is addressed to the captives in Babylon who were surrounded by the powerfully successful official gods of the Babylonian pantheon. But really, it's addressed to everyone returning to Judea with perhaps too much Babylonian polytheistic religiosity. They maybe even had packed some statues. Maybe somewhere in their baggage were some holy dice. The admonition was clear. When returning to Judea, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, don't hide them in your baggage. Leave the teraphim behind. Thank you.